Hello everyone, I'm Greg Scott. I'm a nurse at Carl in the Faith Community Health Department. Thank you for joining us today, and hopefully you were able to join us for our last week's presentation on advanced care planning. And so today I'm joined by two of my colleagues from Carl, and they'll introduce themselves so we can ask some questions and answers to do a deeper dive into advanced care planning. Jeannie.
Okay, I'm Jeannie Douglas. I also am a nurse by background, and I'm currently serving in the role of Advanced Care Planning Supervisor at Carl. So kind of spearheading the Advanced Care Planning Department and getting information out to our patients.
I'm Danna Williamson. I'm also a nurse. I work in the Faith Community Health Department. So I'm going to start by asking Jeannie a question first.
Okay.
So when you plan ahead for future healthcare decisions, what is that called?
So that is what we do call advanced care planning. So the idea is doing a little planning ahead of time before there's a situation where you're in a medical facility, ours or someone else's, where you could not speak for yourself. And that could be caused by many things, from a car accident to a stroke to a heart attack. People of all ages, adults of all ages, this applies to them because of those very things. You can be a young adult in a car accident, older adult with a stroke. Same situation, unable to speak for yourself, and by doing some of this planning, which we'll talk about more in detail, you can be prepared for those moments, and people can step up and speak for you on your behalf.
Okay, wonderful. So Greg, do I only need to think about advanced care planning when I'm sick or injured?
No, great question, Danna. And to add to what Jeannie was saying, this is really for all events. It's planning ahead. So it's like planning anything within life. And you want to make sure that you're planning for those accidents or sudden unexpected. But even if someone's having an outpatient procedure and there needs to be a healthcare decision made during that procedure, having these conversations and plans ahead of time will be important.
Mm-hmm. Jeannie, do I need to hire an attorney for these advanced care directives that you're speaking of?
For the healthcare advanced directives, the answer is no, actually. You can get a copy from Carl. You could get them off the IDPH website. There are many ways to access advanced directives, which are the paperwork parts of the advanced care planning. So once you have thought through who you would like to be, we call it a healthcare agent. That's the person you've named to speak for you when you cannot speak for yourself. The power of attorney for healthcare is the document that you can use to document that decision. There's also a living will document, which some people like to use to talk about possible end-of-life treatments or lack of treatments, things that they would not want at end of life. But the document that is incredibly helpful to a healthcare team is that power of attorney for healthcare document. And you really can do them on your own. You can do them with assistance from sometimes a medical social worker. At Carl, we have some trained advanced care planning facilitators. So there's various ways to do it free of charge to get those things on paper.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
Greg, when I name a healthcare agent in my advanced directives, do I lose the ability to make any changes or make my healthcare decisions anymore?
No, actually, and a lot of individuals have the misconception and think that that's what this is about, that you're turning these decisions over to another person, but really you're not. You're actually empowering that person to speak for you only in instances where you're unable to speak for yourself in healthcare decisions. So that spokesperson or what Jeannie alluded to, the agent that you name on this advanced directive form, is only going to speak when you're unable to.
Okay, great. So once I have that advanced directive on file, can I just forget about it and move on?
Unfortunately, no. That happens. But think about life changes that occur over your adulthood. So if you complete this work when maybe you're in your 20s, 25, and maybe you're unmarried or no significant other in your life. You might name your mom or your dad or somebody as an agent. But then several years later, you could get married and have, somebody else that you would prefer to have as an agent at that time. And so every time there is a significant life experience, we really encourage people to look at your forms again and make sure they still reflect what your wishes are and the people you want named. Other life experiences that matter are like if there's a death in your family, if you have a new diagnosis of something like a chronic illness that, when you first get diagnosed with some of these things, you're fairly fine. But it's the long term that your health will start to decline. So while you still are of sound mind and can think through all these things, make sure your documents reflect what you want. Also, documents age. I have actually helped people update documents simply because we've moved away from home phone numbers and we have cell phone numbers now. So even though they named the same person, their contact information has changed, and that really helps us as your healthcare team that we can open that document and find the correct phone number right away and get in touch with that person. Now, in the day and age of distance working, a new thing that's kind of come to the forefront is you can actually live in a different state but work for an organization, so if your address has changed and you're no longer in a particular state, you should do documents for that particular state. So if you work in Illinois but you live in Arizona, you need to do Arizona documents, even though your employer might be in Illinois. So COVID brought a lot of that on, where people are working remotely quite a ways away. So be attuned to your state documents.
Greg, does Medicare cover any of this advanced care planning?
Yes, it does. And so a lot of individuals, and we alluded to earlier that there's not a cost associated with this and so forth. But if someone does schedule an appointment with their doctor, with their primary doctor, to go in and discuss this, there may be an office visit charge. So Medicare does cover and allow for an advanced care planning discussion. When the individual calls to schedule that appointment, they should specify that's what the appointment is for, so that that can be documented when they're scheduling and doing the visit, so the provider will know that's why they're coming in to talk, and they can have that facilitated conversation. Okay. But Medicare does cover those type of costs even as well.
Okay, great. So there's lots of decisions to be made in the advanced care planning process. What are some of those decisions?
I think one way to think about advanced care planning is thinking of planning a big trip, whether it's a trip to Europe or Colorado or something like that. The first thing you want to do is decide, what do you want out of this trip, or what are your personal desires? What do you want to see? What do you want to do? And that's true with advanced care planning. What personally matters most to you? What values, maybe there's cultural or spiritual beliefs that impact your choices of what healthcare decisions you would make, family dynamics, and financial. There's lots of things that impact our healthcare choices. So you first have to really personalize it and decide what matters most to you. What are your values and your perspective on these sort of things? And sometimes that takes some conversation with family too, right? Then if you think about a trip, you're probably going to ask people who have gone before you. So sometimes it's important to talk to your physician, as Greg had just said, like depending on your personal health, you might want to ask about, okay, I have this diagnosis. What do you think about if I went into the ICU? And get some conversation with your provider or others. You could be, some family members, again, that you want some information from. Then we hope you're sharing all of those thoughts and wishes and values with the people who know you and love you, so that if this moment ever occurs that you're unable to speak for yourself, that those people feel empowered, as Greg had used that word, to speak for you. and then writing it down. So much like if you're doing a trip, you're going to write down your itinerary, you're going to make sure you know when you have to get on the plane and when you have to get the connecting flight, and all of that in written form is your reference. And so when you've done the kind of the thinking, the planning, the asking the right questions, choosing the healthcare agent, talking to your family, then writing it gives everybody the same kind of reference point to work from. So that's how I envision advanced care planning.
Great. Greg, do I have to make all my advanced care decisions at one time?
No, not at all. That's a great question, because a lot of people feel like they need to jump in and do this right away. And Jeannie alluded earlier about the planning process, and it really is a process. It starts with that self-reflection and just sitting quietly and thinking about what are my wishes and desires. If something ever rendered me unable to make my own healthcare decisions, what would I want in that situation? What would it look like? And then once you start to go through that process, then you finish the rest of the plan that Jeannie just laid out. But you definitely do not want to do it just all at once. You want to make this an ongoing process.
And if I could just add to that, I think, again, when you're younger, you may not have health issues. Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit more straightforward. You kind of know your values, you know your wishes, and really the important piece there is naming that healthcare agent. Yes. But as we age, the majority of us are going to end up with some sort of illness, chronic illness that impacts our health and changes over time. So that's when the conversation begins to develop a little more deeply. You have more questions for your provider. The provider has more information to share with you because he's not going to share with you something about an illness you don't have, right? So that's where advanced care planning grows as you age, because there's more things to discover, learn, ask, and more things you might want to write down as you learn those things. But yeah, it kind of starts small with name an agent, and then grow as your lifespan changes. So,
okay. If I don't complete a healthcare power of attorney, can my children do that for me?
Oh, well, believe it or not, in the state of Illinois, there is a what's called the Illinois Healthcare Surrogate Act. Illinois Healthcare Surrogate Act. So, if you and I do not choose our healthcare agent, that's the person we're naming to be our spokesperson, then by law, we as your healthcare provider have to refer to the Act. And the Act tells us in order who we seek as your voice. So, of course, it has to be an adult, and that's over 18. So if your children are 16 or 17, we're not going to seek your children. But the Act is going to start with like a guardianship of your person, which the majority of Americans don't have. That generally applies to, a guardian is somebody with special needs or something. And then it defaults to your spouse. In the state of Illinois, that's a civilized union that's been recognized by the state, not like maybe a long-term boyfriend or girlfriend. And then from there it goes down to adult children. So there is an order in which it goes for us. And that can matter in some families, because I've actually sat down with families, and when I explain that to families, the spouse, the couple might both be in their 80s, and so they realize, like, I might not be in a good place mentally, emotionally, to make decisions for my spouse, who I've been married to for 60 years. And so they like to think about, well, let's get our children involved, and maybe one of them could be, the agent. So sometimes understanding how that really works out in real life helps us also think through our choices. So.
And if I may add to what Jeannie's saying, that's the importance of the documents being completed ahead of time. And so really no one can complete the document on your behalf unless there's a court-appointed guardian situation where someone's doing it. But typically, If a person is in their sound mind and they're able to complete the forms, no one else can complete them for them. They have to complete them, and then they have to sign it themselves. And then there is a witness area on the healthcare power of attorneys that then requires that witness not be the person that's named as the agent spokesperson, and not a person that's related through blood or marriage. And so that's important to remember. Is some people feel, oh, well, I'll just have my child fill this out for me. They're okay to fill it out for me. But that's really not the case. Legally, they should fill it out themselves and sign it themselves.
Thank you. Yeah, I might have misunderstood your question.
Yeah,
Thank you
no
for
problem.
clarifying that.
Thank you. So Greg, the best way to document advanced care plans in writing is?
Yeah, so the best way is that, you can clearly communicate those choices on these forms. And so, the forms are laid out. You can retrieve them from Carl. You can request them. We'll provide that information at the end of the presentation of where you can request these forms. You can go to the website that we'll provide to download and print them out. You can come to a community health fair or anywhere that Carl has a booth. We'll be able to provide those as well. And so those forms then are able to be filled out, and we provide detailed instructions on how to fill them out. And as Jeanny alluded earlier, there's trained facilitators in our clinic locations at those physician offices. So if anyone would have the need for assistance, they could schedule a time to go in and meet with one of those facilitators to answer more detailed questions.
Okay, great. Jeanny, what's the main difference between advanced care planning and advanced directives?
Yeah, those two terms are definitely out there in healthcare, and I think it is confusing. So really just think of it, the difference between the planning being all of the thoughtful pieces and the advanced directives, think of paperwork. So advanced directives are one piece of the entire process of advanced care planning. And I don't like to say it's the end piece. It's the end of probably a lot of initial work, but as we mentioned earlier, we do want you to revisit it at appropriate times. But think of advanced directives as the formal written pieces of paper that explain your wishes, right? And explain who you've chosen as your agent and that sort of thing. Whereas the advanced care planning is all of the steps that you've taken personally to lead up to the point of putting that information in writing. So that's kind of the difference between the two.
Great. So Greg, can you tell me about my role as a healthcare agent? Maybe what it is, what it isn't?
Yeah, so as the agent, and I always like to just refer to it as you're a spokesperson. So you're the voice for whoever has named you as their agent. It is a true honor and it's a privilege to be named because someone is trusting you. They've shared with you their wishes, their deepest thoughts and wishes and desires if they're ever rendered unable to speak for themselves when it comes to healthcare decisions. And so you are now empowered with that information they've shared in those conversations leading up to this situation. And it's never easy. I want to allude to that. Being a healthcare agent is never an easy position or role to be in. But hopefully you are armed with the knowledge and with those conversations that this person has shared with you, so that now you're a spokesperson, you're the voice. So when the healthcare team comes to you and says, this situation is occurring, what would this person like that's your friend or relative that has named you as their agent? And so then that's what you are then. You are the voice.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jeanny, why is it important for me to share what a good day looks like for me with my healthcare agent?
Yeah, we like that question in the world of advanced care planning. What's a good day, or what brings meaning to your life? Again, if you think about this over the lifespan of an adult, in your 20s or 30s, there are things that really matter to you, things that you do, activities you do, or people you spend time with that really bring your life a lot of meaning. But as we age and as we grow and change and our health changes, those things can change as well, and they do change. I mean, they just really do change. And I've had people even with chronic pain who will say to me, a good day is waking up without pain, and so it can be boiled down to some of the simplistics, but if we just stop and reflect on what really matters, and if my agent needs to know the things that matter most to me in my life, and what brings meaning, what gives me a good day, the people I'm with, the things I'm doing, what does that look like? And that will, again, it's just giving them a framework to make those decisions, because you can't prep them for every little detail, but you can give them a framework about who you are. Hopefully they know you fairly well. You might be picking somebody, a family member, but even still, it's amazing how we as family members assume things of one another, and we don't necessarily know until we ask. So, yeah.
Greg, what are some good qualities of a healthcare agent?
Well, I think that first of all, not everyone feels comfortable being a healthcare agent, and I just want to share that with those watching, that it's okay to say no to a friend or a relative that has asked you to serve in this agent role. It's okay to say, I don't think I would have the strength to do that in that moment. It's better to find these things out ahead of time, because unfortunately the healthcare teams find these things out in a moment of need. That a person that's been named as an agent says, I don't know, we didn't talk about that, or I can't make that decision. Or the scenarios, some of that Jeanny referred to, that the paperwork hasn't been done, the conversations haven't been had, the plans aren't made, and now you have multiple people in this situation saying, we don't know what they would want. We don't know what a good day looks like for them. And so I think that, first of all, willingness to accept the role and having that conversation. Second of all, I think that recognizing that I can place my own personal convictions, my wishes, my own belief structures, set that all aside, because now as the agent and spokesperson, I'm representing this person that has given me this honor and asked me to serve as an agent. So that's the importance. And then willing to talk about those things, because it's a difficult conversation to talk about this openly. That's what we hope to do as a team. We're out in the community trying to provide education and increase awareness so that it is a more normalized topic. It's not so scary, that individuals see it as more of a life plan process of completing this. But the agent really needs to just realize, if it's in their power, if they have that power to do that in that moment, and if they don't, say to this person, I don't think I can do this.
Yeah, like Greg said, I think when an agent is asked to make those decisions, it almost always is a little bit of an emotional, stressful moment, right? So, I'll bust out my own family here, but I'm the nurse amongst 3 daughters. So it's a little bit logical choice that my dad would have chosen me as his healthcare agent, simply because I've been in medical situations enough to not feel overwhelmed by the moment. And so that's a thing to consider when you're being asked to be somebody's agent, or if you're choosing an agent. It was logical in my dad's situation to say, I think my nurse daughter will be the best choice, and because it will be emotional and I won't enjoy the moment. And I actually will share the moment with my sisters. I'm certainly not intending to be a lone ranger, but I will definitely get the, input from my sisters. But when it comes to talking to doctors and asking questions and that sort of thing, I will probably have a little more comfort with the environment, having the background I have. So that matters. Some of your children or family members will have a little more comfort in those situations than others. So.
Yes.
Okay. Choosing to continue medical treatment or stop medical treatment in a situation of severe permanent brain damage injury with little chance of recovery. Which part of the advanced care planning process would that be? Is that something my doctor can do for me? Is it something else?
So we talk about that kind of as a goal of care. So if, again, it's not the scenario that any of us want to think about, but the truth is any adult can be in a situation where the doctors say, we've tried everything we medically know how to do. This would be a scenario where we've sought second and third opinions, and we've run every test, and medically, there's almost always an end to what we can offer and what we can do to attempt to solve situations, And those are difficult moments when we have to share that news with family. But the opportunity of having this discussion ahead of time is for an individual to say, if that moment comes and the doctors tell you, the chance is very small of survival, we've tried everything, then I want you to either continue. Living matters to me, no matter what the cost, no matter what the amount of suffering you think I'm having, because it's really hard to discern that sometimes. No matter how long it takes, I want you to try. So that's some people's choice. And if that's your choice, we need to know it so that we can honor it, right? Other people will choose the opposite and say, nope, if I'm in that situation and the doctors say they've done everything, then my goal would be that you just let me go quietly, peacefully. You can stop aggressive treatment and just let me go. And there's going to be others in between that say, I don't know, and that's okay, because it's exactly what Greg was saying is it's hard to kind of conceptualize these things. We need to normalize it and talk about it so that you can say, I don't know right now. But as the months change and the years go on, you might come to a different conclusion, and you could share that with your agent and say, I have an opinion now. So yeah, we kind of call that the imagine if the worst case scenario happens, what would be your personal goals of care in that situation?
Okay.
And to add what Jeanny was saying, when you're talking about this, reflecting yourself about this scenario and situation, and you're discussing it with your identified spokesperson agent, the scenario would be, what is permanent brain injury? What's that mean? And we oftentimes will say, if the physicians and the medical team that's caring for your loved one or yourself, and they say that there's little chance of recovery to where you know who you are or who you're with, what would your wishes be in that instance? And that kind of frames what that permanent brain injury might look like. So that when you're thinking about this and talking about it amongst your chosen agent, that's the scenario you can use, and in addition to what Jeanny was saying.
Okay.
That's good.
How are cultural beliefs and spiritual needs part of advanced care planning?
So that is a wonderful question, because it's at the core, life experiences, what that good day looks like. Those are things we've talked about, but also there's so many other things with cultural and spiritual beliefs. There might be certain things that you want your agent to ensure happens in those moments that they're now your spokesperson. There might be certain music, certain prayers, certain meditation, certain foods brought in or a candle lit, those kind of things. Those are all the things that are cultural or spiritual that really should be shared with your identified agent spokesperson, so they can share that with the health team. Because the health team, as a whole, that's a lot of people involved in that health team. And it's our wishes to really make those moments special, and that we fulfill the wishes and desires of individuals in this situation.
Yeah.
Is it natural to have fears and concerns about making these healthcare decisions?
Very natural. So much so that I think many avoid it. And that's one reason we like to use the term normalization, normalizing this topic. In fact, I would like one way we're trying to move this is even as preventative type of care for yourself and your family. So just like you do other things for preventive sake, right? Like whether you get vaccinated or, even you go to the dentist to prevent cavities, right? The things that we do to prevent ourselves from getting sick, eating healthy and mammograms, colonoscopies, all these things that are part of normal preventative care. We want to think about this as preventative care too. And so to try to move away from that fear and that worrisome piece of it and just think of it as this is normal, healthy planning for myself. And also remember when we avoid it because of our fears, the end result can be really difficult for the people who are then having to make decisions for you without the skill set, the tools, because we just didn't have these conversations. So they're hard to start, they're difficult, but it's interesting that most people, I think across the board we hear very often, I'm so glad we finally talked about this. It's so hard to initiate it, but nobody seems to regret initiating it. Once they get through an initial conversation, then the secondary and third conversations as they come along will be much more natural because they're building off of that first one. So, yeah.
Well, and I think that the important part, to add what Jeannie's saying, which is so true, just to reiterate what we've been saying between Jeannie and I, no one knows when this is going to come into play, and I think that that's the oftentimes misperception of individuals is, oh, I have plenty of time, I'm healthy, I can wait, but these are for short-term or longer-term decision making. Spokespersons that are the identified agents for healthcare might be just needed, like I mentioned earlier, that short term because someone's having a one-day surgery, outpatient surgery procedure, and there just needs to be some decisions. Anytime a person's under the effects of sedation or general anesthesia, they're rendered unable to speak for themselves. And it's important they have this process done, they've had the advanced directive paperwork completed and on file, and then that person's empowered because they know what the wishes are. So I think that's the important part. Yes, it is, like Jeannie said, difficult to initiate the conversations and get them started, but then most individuals are happy they did have these conversations.
Great. Which documents specifically help with designating my finances and my personal affairs?
Oh, that's such a good question, Danna. Individuals oftentimes get these mixed up. And so it's important to understand that when we talk about the healthcare power of attorney, that is separate. It's specific in the living will. Those are healthcare specific. So they are not finances, they're not the last will and testament. Those are documents that need a little more attention for individuals that are going to be making legal and financial decisions from I like to say from your normal business, keeping your household running and things, keeping the utilities paid and things. And then also, oftentimes we hear on that last will and testament, the executor is basically the spokesperson for that last will and testament. So completely different processes. Oftentimes people do have attorneys assist them in developing those documents because they deal with money and possessions.
Okay,
Yes.
great, thank you. So, Jeannie, I hear some different terms, healthcare power of attorney, healthcare agent, healthcare proxy. Could you clarify a little bit about, are those the same thing?
They really are. In our state, I would say the most common you hear is healthcare power of attorney, or they might reverse it and say power of attorney for healthcare. So you kind of hear the title on the actual document will say power of attorney for healthcare. But in everyday language, we sometimes say healthcare power of attorney. Then the actual document itself will also say healthcare agent, where you actually put the person's name and address and phone number. So in our state, you're going to hear healthcare power of attorney, healthcare agent. Those are very common. In other states, you're going to hear the word proxy more. It's not that you won't hear it here. I think you hear it at lawyer's office, but on our documents, you're not going to read that word. But they're all used interchangeably. So if you move from Illinois and you get a new document and it's using the word proxy, it's the same, yeah. Who's going to speak for you when you can't speak for yourself in a medical situation, not in those financial situations. Yeah.
And to add, because a lot of people, even to add to the confusion that Jeannie was just saying that individuals might have about these titles, a lot of people will say next of kin. And that's more of a layperson's term to describe the closest living relative. So it's not necessarily the person that's been identified as the agent on this document, but it could be just someone refers to next of kin because that's their closest living relative.
Good. Greg, can I complete the advance directive documents without anyone else knowing?
Well, I hope not. Hopefully what we've shared today really speaks to the importance of having these conversations, normalizing the conversation. Not only sharing these with your designated agent and spokesperson, but sharing it amongst your family and friends that might be involved in this so that they can lift up and support who you've identified and named as your agent. It's important that everyone is aware that these are your wishes and your desires. And it also hopefully will share the importance among families and friends of that everyone of adult age has this completed, has went through the planning process and completed the documents and provided them to their healthcare system.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and speaking as like my dad's agent, it's beneficial to me to think about the fact that I would have the support of my sisters, so the fact that you are sharing these the choices you've made and the documents with other people. My sisters all have a copy, and so that is, yes, you could do the documents and turn them in and not talk to anybody, but the value of that is very minimal and can actually be shocking to the people who had never seen the documents before, so we really do advise that documents come with or at the end of a long conversation and involving all your loved ones.
Okay, great.
And one thing, if I can add, because I hadn't thought of it previous, we oftentimes think about it, that oftentimes an individual can add a successor agent as well. And so I just want individuals in the audience to understand that, you can have a successor on there. So if you're first identified agent, is not available and so forth, then there's someone else that you've had these conversations with and shared your wishes and desires, and they're named on that form as well as a successor agent.
Yes, and we highly advise filling that portion out. It's optional. You don't have to name successors, but as Greg just mentioned, your first choice may not be available. My spouse is my first choice, but if he and I are in the same car accident, then maybe he can't answer either, you know? So that makes it important to have that successor named, because once again, you've selected. We're not falling to having to default to the law. We are going with your choices and the person who knows you best next in line, you know, so very important part of the form.
Okay. So, Jeannie, this is kind of a two-part question.
Okay.
I wondered if you would be able to define what POST stands for.
Oh, yeah.
And also if that can be changed, revoked, or once I file the POST, if that's a permanent form with my provider.
Sure. So a POST is completely different than the other two forms we've highlighted today. So we've talked about the power of attorney for healthcare, which is really going to name a person to speak for you. We've talked about the living will, which is giving you the opportunity to say, if I were in a terminal situation, that worst case scenario, how you feel about stopping medical treatment. But the POST is something that you see in our state that people will often refer to it as the DNR, or do not resuscitate form. And that really is what it should be used for. So it should be thought of as a very end-of-life form. It stands for, you asked me that question, Practitioner's Order for Life-Sustaining Treatment. So that's where you get your POST. And this is a document you definitely want to talk over line by line with your physician. Once you've made choices on this document, and the first choice is going to be I want CPR versus I do not want CPR. But after that, there are choices about how aggressive you want your medical treatments. You can choose to not be ventilated and you know, IV fluids. I mean, there's choices in there. It also talks about feeding tubes. That's another choice. So as you can tell, this is a very detailed form about medical interventions, which is why you need some time with your provider on this form. But once it's signed by you as the patient, and then your witness, and then the provider, it's actually what we call an order, a medical order, and it travels with you outside the hospital. So if you're at home and you have this order, then the EMS, if they arrive at your home, can honor your wishes on the medical order, the POST form. So, yeah.
And just to share, it's important if you do have that in your planning process. So it is separate from the advanced care planning, as Jeannie alluded, but it's important if you have that and you went through that process, that you have it with you, or an individual with you has a copy at all times. Because if you've identified that you do not want resuscitation efforts in the event that you go into cardiorespiratory arrest, then the EMS and fire department providers will need to see that form. So that's why it's so important, because as Jeannie alluded, it is in essence a medical order. And so they'll need to see that if that's what the desire is, to not start CPR.
Okay, thank you. So is the living will and the POST the same thing? Can you explain that a little bit?
So they are not, and so they are distinctly different. So as Jeannie alluded, that this is a medical order on the POST form. And it can go very specifically dealing with end-of-life resuscitation and end-of-life care. Living wills are a little different because it is something dealing with like your care aspects, to where you can identify if you want certain things done or not done in your care process. And so if you are identified that you have a significant medical condition and you want certain things administered or not administered, you want them withheld or and so forth, you can do that on a living will. You can also be very specific on the POST form as well, but most of those on the POST are typically associated with life sustainment, you know, and end-of-life decision care processes. That's why it's important that a provider practitioner is involved in that and has to sign off on that POST form. But the living will, you don't need that signature of a practitioner provider. And so hopefully that clarifies the difference between those two.
Well, and I would encourage people to just literally read the living will. It's just a paragraph or maybe a little bit longer than that. It's not super long in the state of Illinois. Each state is slightly different. But it really comes down, if you look at the title, it's called Living Will Declaration. So really, if you read the verbiage on it, you as an individual are declaring that if I ever have a terminal condition, and terminal is a key word on that document, because it's not if you have an accident and you're in the ER, okay? It's when you have a terminal condition and life expectancy or, we expect that you are not going to have long on this earth, right? Then you are declaring that I am willing to have them stop aggressive treatment. So it's really a stopping declaration, but it's not a physician order. So it's just your last way to communicate when you are in a terminal situation what your wishes would be, where the order is actionable by EMS or any healthcare agent. I mean, any nurse or anybody, if we see the pulse, that is a medical order that we treat differently than a living will.
Okay, thank you. So if I decide I want to decline CPR, my first step is that form you're referring to, and it has to be on file with my provider. I can't keep it at home or keep it in my records, correct? It's important that they have that?
Technically, you should always have the original. So the person who writes it should have the original. Again, we mentioned that it has to be seen, which therefore we don't recommend a pulse until you are probably close to homebound, because very few of us are going to carry this piece of paper around with us out in the community, right? But if you are at home, you can post it on your refrigerator, you can post it above your bed, you can post it in a very obvious place, so EMS or whomever would see it. So the original should always be with the person who wrote it, but a copy should definitely be on file with any of your healthcare providers. So if you go to a different primary care physician, then hospital, you see some specialists, be sure that they all have a copy. And if they're within the Carl network, we all have, one copy, we see it all, right?
Yes.
But I mean, a lot of people go up to Chicago or Barnes in St. Louis or other places, and they would also need a copy if that's what you're doing.
And to add what Jeannie's saying, if you have done this process and you've went through the logical steps and you've done advanced care planning and now you've completed an advanced directive and named an agent, may have a living will, may not, but now you've progressed and you have a completed pulsed form that is completed and filled out and signed by your provider and practitioner, that your agent from your advanced directive, that they have a copy of that pulse form as well. Because if they are now, contacted in a situation where they're being asked, would they want CPR or not CPR, they have that pulse form, but they also should have the knowledge from conversations as well to be able to answer that question easily.
Okay. So Greg, what happens if I'm outside of the hospital? How will they know that I don't want CPR?
That's a great question, and to add what Jeannie said, and hopefully we're saying it
repeating ourselves.
times, but none of us know when a medical crisis or emergency or a trauma of some sort will occur. And if this is our wishes and desires when it comes to end-of-life sustainment with CPR or no CPR, ventilator, no ventilator, those type of questions, then that form should be with you and should be at all times easily accessible by those around you, because like we've shared, if an ambulance arrives or the fire department arrives, they're most likely going to start CPR in those moments unless someone presents this legal document that's completed and signed.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Danna.
That is all my questions for this afternoon.
Well, thank
Great
you, and
information.
hopefully we've answered everyone's questions in the audience and provided a more in-depth, deep dive into advanced care planning. Please see on your screens further information of where you can reach out to Jeannie's team at Carl at the Advanced Care Planning Office, or phone call them, as well as on the websites. There's more information available. Thank you and have a blessed day.
Thank you for tuning into WiseTV. We hope you enjoyed the show. This video can be accessed anytime on youtube.com. In the YouTube search bar, type in UPTV6 and look for their microphone logo. We hope you will join us again next week for more local, engaging content designed specifically for Champaign County older adults. Take care and stay safe.